I am really excited about this series. I want to acknowledge up front that the dramatic structure and some of the teaching insights that are in this lesson were adapted from other teachers who've explored the book of Job the way I'm going to. I adapted it for our class, but I don't want to take credit for all of the ideas here. So today we're going to talk about the book of Job. The book of Job. Yes. And I need to warn you, I need to set an expectation before we begin. By the end of this lesson, you may have more questions than answers. And that's not a failure of the lesson, it's a part of the design. Some lessons are not meant to be rushed. If you stay with us for the next two lessons, we're going to continue to unfold the story and why it matters for our spiritual growth. So this morning, we're going to mess with one of your deepest assumptions about how life works. You may not even know you have this assumption, but you probably do. Have you ever quietly believed, even if you wouldn't say it out loud, that if you do everything right, life would cooperate? Guilty. If I do everything right, things will go well. If I do what's wrong, things will go badly. It's clean. It's satisfying. It's morally stable. And to be clear, that instinct's not foolish. Much of Scripture teaches that obedience aligns us with life. But it's also not how life always works, right? And the Bible knows that. Before we ever open the book of Job, we need to understand something about where it sits in Scripture, because its placement's not random. It's brilliant. To understand Job, we have to understand where it sits in the story. In the ancient world, almost every culture viewed life as cyclical. Crops grow, crops die. Seasons turn. The sun rises, the sun sets. The moon waxes and wanes. Civilizations rise and fall. It's the circle of life. I'm not going to sing the whole thing. Yes. And if life is cyclical, then meaning doesn't really matter, right? It just repeats. But the Hebrews did something radical. While other cultures often emphasized cyclical rhythms, the Hebrew scriptures introduced a radically purposeful, covenantal moment in history. Creation, fall, redemption, beginning, middle, end. And that changes everything. Genesis lays the foundation. Creation, sin, the promise of salvation. And from Genesis all the way through Esther, we have a linear story unfolding. Creation, covenant, kingdom, collapse, exile, and return. This is not just a story about events. It's a story about God forming a people who know Him. The Old Testament narrative in its linear form ends with Esther. After Esther, the books that follow are either poetic reflections like Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, or prophetic commentary that run parallel to the story. They're giving us a commentary on what happened during that storyline. And Esther closes the historical storyline. And what's the lesson up to that point? So it's essentially Deuteronomy 28, and I want to read that. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all His commandments that I'm giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world. You will experience all these blessings if you obey the Lord your God. Your towns and your fields will be blessed. Your children and your crops will be blessed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be blessed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be blessed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be blessed. The Lord will conquer your enemies when they attack you. They will attack you from one direction, but they will scatter from you in seven. The Lord will guarantee a blessing on everything you do and will fill your storehouses with grain. The Lord will bless you in the land He is giving you. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God and walk in His ways, the Lord will establish you as His holy people as he swore he would do. Then all the nations of the world will see that you are a people claimed by the Lord, and they will stand in awe of you. The Lord will give you prosperity in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you, blessing you with many children, numerous livestock, and abundant crops. The Lord will send rain at the proper time from his rich treasury in the heavens, and will bless all the work you do. You will lend to many nations, but you will never need to borrow from them. If you listen to these commands of the Lord your God that I'm giving you today, and you carefully obey them, the Lord will make you the head and not the tail, and you will always be on top and never at the bottom. You must not turn away from any of the commands I'm giving you today, nor follow after other gods and worship them. And the other half of the chapter, which I'm just not going to read for the sake of time, gives all of the what's going to happen, and it's the total opposite if you don't obey God. So I want to pause here for a moment. I've taught from Deuteronomy 28 before, and I still believe it. What we're going to say today doesn't contradict that message. It just reveals that God's world is bigger than the formula that we sometimes reduce it to. Because when you look honestly at history and at life, you begin to notice something troubling. Moses tells Israel, obey God, blessings. Disobey God, curses. And then history plays out. And what Moses says is clear, clean, ordered. But did Israel obey? No. The result, in 722 BC, Assyria wipes out the northern kingdom. In 586 BC, Babylon destroys Jerusalem and the temple. The warnings of Deuteronomy 28 appear to have played out exactly as Moses said they would. But then something surprising happens. Just when it looks like the story of Israel might be over, when the people are scattered and the temple is gone, God began moving in unexpected ways. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. And instead of keeping the Jewish people in exile, he does something remarkable. He allows them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So there is restoration. But it's not the triumphant restoration that people expected. The nation is smaller, the kingdom is weaker, and the glory of the earlier days is gone. The restoration is real, but it's fragile. And by this point in Israel's story, something else has become increasingly obvious. This neat equation of obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings curse. For a developing nation that was learning covenant faithfulness, that clarity was necessary. It formed them. It taught them that your actions matter. Israel wasn't just a collection of individuals trying to live a good life. They were an entirely new kind of society, a people called by God to reflect his character in the world. They were learning how living life under God's rule worked. So the covenant needed to be clear and concrete. Obedience leads to blessing. Disobedience leads to consequences. That principle formed them. It taught them that actions matter, that choices have consequences, that life under God is not random or morally chaotic. In other words, it gave them a moral framework. It taught them that history is not governed by blind fate, but by a God who cares about justice and righteousness. For a young nation learning how to walk with God, that clarity was essential. But as history unfolds, we begin to discover something unsettling. That equation, while true in principle, doesn't always appear to match lived reality. So here's the tension. What happens when a faithful life doesn't produce predictable outcomes? Sometimes good people suffer. Sometimes the wicked prosper. And that raises a deeply uncomfortable question of what happens when a faithful life doesn't produce predictable outcomes. Enter Job. Job asks the most dangerous theological question in the Old Testament. Why do terrible things happen to a righteous man? And Job doesn't whisper it. He demands an answer. And let's be honest, we always hear about the patience of Job, That phrase comes from James 5:11 in the King James Version. I'm going to read it. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. But the Greek word here really means perseverance or endurance, not patience. Job's not sitting quietly in the ash heap. He is scraping his diseased skin with pottery and demanding that God justify himself. He says essentially three things. Either you caused this, or you allowed this, or you just don't care. Those are the options. And I want to know which one it is. That's bold. That's uncomfortable. But it's also human. Because if his understanding of God is wrong, then everything he built his life on is unstable. Because every one of us have sat in some version of the ash heap and thought, God, what are you doing? So here's where the story becomes fascinating. If you wanted to answer the problem of evil, you could write a theological treatise. You could give us 10 principles. You could give us a systematic breakdown. But instead, the Bible gives us a play. Job is structured as a drama. It has a prologue, several rounds of argument that unfold almost like acts of a play, and finally an epilogue where God speaks. The drama unfolds in several rounds of argument between Job and his friends, and the arguments are not random. They represent three powerful voices that still exist in our culture today. It's brilliant. And this is how we're going to experience it. Not as a quiet devotional, but as a staged reading. Because the tension in the story is meant to be felt. In Act 1, Job speaks first. He lays out his anguish, and then three friends respond. Eliphaz is the voice of experience. Eliphaz says, I've lived long enough to see how this works. In my experience, God doesn't punish innocent people. You're being punished, so you're not innocent. Experience-based theology. We still hear that voice today. Well, in my experience, Job replies, listen, I may not be perfect, but I am not that guilty. Zophar is the voice of tradition. Zophar says, look at the ancients. Look at what has always been taught. Wise men of old understood this. The translation is, this is what we've always believed. Tradition-based certainty. Job again refuses. He says, I've not done anything that would justify this. Now, Bildad is the voice of religion. And by now, Job's frustration is boiling over. He questions God's fairness. Bildad responds, Job, you must not speak about God like that. If you were more pious, you would understand. Religion needs to protect God's reputation instead of wrestling with the question. And Job calls it what it is: cliches, pious nonsense, empty phrases stirred around like old soup. The debate continues, but something interesting happens. The arguments don't actually move forward. Nothing new is introduced. The same ideas just return over and over again, only each time they're sharper, more forceful, more defensive. The friends repeat the same accusations. Job repeats the same defense. Back and forth they go, round after round. And if you read the text carefully, you start to notice something. The arguments aren't becoming clearer, they're becoming louder. And have you ever noticed that about debates? When people run out of insight, the volume increases. But volume and wisdom are not the same thing. The voices grow harsher. The accusations grow stronger. Everyone becomes more certain of their stance. But no one becomes wiser. Eventually, the debate burns itself out. Job is exhausted, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. After all the arguments, all the explanations, all the accusations, he finally says, I have nothing more to say. The room falls quiet. For a moment, it seems like the debate simply reached a dead end. There's no answers, no resolution, just silence. And then a new voice enters the conversation. A younger man steps forward. His name is Elihu, and he's the voice of youth. He's been listening the entire time, watching, waiting, and now he speaks. He looks at the friends and he essentially says, you're all missing the point. You've been arguing about the wrong question. You've been defending the wrong assumptions. And as Elihu starts to speak, something else begins to happen. At first, it's subtle. The sky begins to shift. The light changes. A wind stirs across the land. Dust lifts from the ground and begins to move through the air. Far off in the distance, dark clouds gather at the horizon. The air grows thick and heavy. The kind of heaviness that tells you a storm is coming. The wind begins to rise. Low thunder rolls somewhere beyond the hills. Elihu keeps speaking, but a little louder. But now the sound of the storm is beginning to compete with his voice. The wind pushes harder. The sky grows darker. Clouds begin stacking upon each other, towering higher and higher. Lightning flickers behind the clouds. Thunder cracks, but it's closer this time. And suddenly the debate that has filled the room for chapter after chapter feels very small. All the arguments, all the accusations, all the explanations, they shrink in the shadow of what's coming, what's approaching, because something far greater than the debate is arriving. The storm growls, the wind howls, dust and darkness swirl through the air, thunder breaks open the sky, and then out of the whirlwind, God speaks. God doesn't provide a tidy explanation. God doesn't say, here are the 3 reasons you suffered. Instead, he asks Job questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? He overwhelms Job with perspective. And in chapter 42, Job says, my ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job doesn't get an explanation. He gets revelation. And somehow, that's enough. So the book of Job doesn't solve the problem of suffering in neat bullet points. It does something more unsettling, and it does something more profound. It exposes something inside of us, our need for control, our need for life to make predictable sense, our quiet belief that if we do the right things, life should cooperate, that faithfulness should guarantee stability, that obedience should protect us from chaos. And when life follows that pattern, we feel reassured. Our theology feels secure. Our understanding of God feels stable. But then something happens. A diagnosis arrives. A tragedy unfolds. A prayer goes unanswered. A faithful life produces an unexpected outcome. And for somebody in this room, that may not feel like a theological discussion. I don't know about for you, but for me, sometimes it feels personal. Maybe you did try to live faithfully. You prayed. You obeyed. You tried to do the right thing when it would have been a whole lot easier not to. And somewhere along the way, life produced an outcome you never expected. A door closed. A prayer went unanswered. A loss came that you never saw coming. And now you're sitting with the question you never thought you'd ask. God, what are you doing? And suddenly the formula stops working. The explanations we trusted feel thin. The voices we relied on begin to sound hollow. And we discover something uncomfortable. Many of us have quietly built our faith on an agreement with God. If I obey, God will bless. If I pray, God will answer. If I live faithfully, my life should make sense. But the book of Job quietly dismantles that assumption. It exposes the voices we trust when life collapses. It exposes how quickly we reach for explanations when suffering appears. And it leaves us standing in the same place that Job stood, in the ashes, looking up at heaven, asking the same question. When the formula breaks, what's left? The book of Job doesn't give us a tidy theological summary. Instead, it invites us into a conversation, into an argument, into a drama. Because the book of Job is not written like a sermon, it's written like a play. Voices enter, arguments collide, accusations fly, faith is tested, and somewhere in the middle of all that tension, God himself steps into the conversation. So next week, rather than simply talking about Job, we're going to step inside the story. We're going to hear the voices, we're going to listen to the arguments, and we're going to feel the tension that's troubled readers for thousands of years. And to make that possible, we're going to hear a version of Job's story that's told in modern language, not to change the meaning, but to help us hear the debate in a way the original audience would have heard it, vividly, personally, and uncomfortably. There are human questions people in this room have asked, questions some of you may still be asking. The full book of Job contains dozens of chapters of debate, and next week we're going to step into the heart of that debate through a dramatic reading that captures the voices and the tension of the story. And we're going to encourage you to listen carefully to the voices. Pay attention to the arguments, because somewhere in that conversation, you might recognize your own voice. And so, with that cliffhanger, I leave you there. Till next week.